Hi everyone. Today I'd like to look at a passage in Acts chapter 17, verses 15 to 34. This is an account when the Apostle Paul first went to the city of Athens and began to preach the gospel of Jesus there in Athens. And I think it's a great passage because it shows us how we can talk to people in a culture that's very different from our own, our Christian culture, and try and find points of connection, areas where we see that people do have a spiritual connection, and then share with them a little bit about the one true living God, and then lead the conversation to Jesus. But to begin reading there in Acts chapter 17 and verse 15, we read, those escorting Paul, he had been in Berea, the city of Berea, those escorting Paul went with him all the way to Athens. Then they returned to Berea with instructions for Silas and Timothy to hurry to join him. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply troubled by all the idols he saw everywhere in the city. Okay. Now we know the Apostle Paul, if you read, the account of his journeys in the book of Acts and the account of his life, he was definitely a man on a mission and very focused on that mission. And as he walked around Athens, he was really bothered about what he saw. The city was just full of idols and temples and shrines, dedicated to these different gods and goddesses, the Greek and the Roman gods and goddesses, and many from other countries as well. But we can identify a bit with that, I think. We should identify with it as we walk around our city, our town, walk around in our culture. Do we see idols, shrines, temples to those idols? Well, I think if we open our eyes, we do see that. People are trying to get us to buy their product, and really in a sense they're trying to get us to follow their idols that they've created. And a lot of things that we see in our culture today, if we get preoccupied with them, they can become our idols. Things like fashion and celebrities and sports and technology, money, sex, power, politics, and many other things. And they can be idols, and they are idols when people put those things in their lives ahead of God or instead of God. Then you've created an idol. So Paul was in the city of Athens, and Athens was known as a city of idols at that time. The name Athens comes from the name of the Greek goddess Athena. She was the goddess of wisdom and warfare. And she was the patron goddess of the city. She protected the city according to their way of thinking. But the city was packed full of idols. Someone estimated that there were about 20,000 different shrines, temples, and altars there in Athens at the time that Paul walked in the streets there. A Roman writer at the same time said it was easier to find a god or a goddess in Athens than it was to find a real person. There were so many of the idols and temples and shrines there. So Paul, the former Pharisee, really dedicated to Judaism before he was called by Jesus to be his apostle to the Gentiles, Paul's in the middle of this culture that was contrary to all his values as a Christian, all the things that he was brought up to believe about God. And so it's contrary to his vision for life, his morals, and Paul became very distressed when he saw all this idolatry around him there in Athens. Remember, this is his first time in the city. But Paul didn't run away from this culture and its idols. He didn't go off, wait by himself until the rest of his missionary team came to help him. No, he set to work right away. And so we read in verse 17 that Paul, he went to the synagogue to reason with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles. And he spoke daily in the public square to all who happened to be there. And that's what a lot of the Athenians did. They just hung around public squares, talking and debating and listening to new ideas. That was sort of the way they spent their time in Athens. Those who didn't have to work for a living, I guess. So first Paul went to the synagogue, as was his custom when he first came into a new city. He shared the good news of salvation in Jesus Christ to the Jews, God's chosen people, and to the God-fearing Gentiles, those who are interested in the one true living God. Then he left the synagogue and went into the public square and preached to those who were wanting to hear what he had to say. He was someone new in the city, and so like he had new ideas. And so the people of Athens were known for their interest in new ideas, new philosophies, new religions, something new to learn. Very similar to today. We have people who love to exchange new ideas, talk about philosophy or whatever the new trend is. So, very similar to what we have today. Carrying on reading in verse 18, he said, he also had a debate with some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. When he told them about Jesus and his resurrection, they said, "What's this babbler trying to say with these strange ideas he's picked up?" Others said he seems to be preaching about some foreign gods. A couple things about that. Well, Athens was known for its many idols, to all the gods and goddesses they could think of, and even the ones they didn't know about. It was also known for its philosophy. Okay, it had a school of philosophy there, sometimes called Plato's Academy, a place where famous philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle and Socrates came together to talk with the people who are interested in their philosophies and exchange ideas. So Athens was known as a center for philosophy and education in the world at that time. And there were a number of very popular philosophies. Epicurean was the followers of Epicurus, and they were basically materialists who did not believe in the divine, in gods and goddesses. They advanced, they promoted a very simple lifestyle where the highest good was to seek pleasure and to avoid pain. A lot of people today are seeking the same thing. And they didn't believe in the divine because they said the fear of the gods only brings pain. Their motto was, eat, drink, and be happy. A lot of people have that motto today as well. And they advocated moderation in pursuing pleasure so as to avoid the suffering and pain that can be brought on by overindulgence in any pleasure. The Stoics, on the other hand, they did believe in the divine, but their God was an impersonal God of the universe, who's present in all of creation, in the rocks and the trees and the mountains and the rivers and lakes. Everything in creation has the soul of the universe, the divine in it. The Stoics taught that you cannot fight against your fate. Your fate has been determined. All the good things and bad things that are going to happen to you are already determined. And so they said just accept it calmly and deal with it in a rational, detached way. That way you will have inner peace and happiness. Okay, so that was the Stoics. So when Paul shows up in Athens and starts talking in the public arena, these philosophers think he's trying to promote a new philosophy. And so they want to hear what it is. That's what they did in Athens. And they listen to him a little bit, then they start to mock him and make fun of him. They call him a babbler. Okay, babbler isn't a word we use much these days, and we think of it as someone who talks too much. But back then, and the Greek word babbler has as its root a seed picker, a bird that goes around picking up seeds. And so a babbler was someone who went around picking up seeds of knowledge and taking them in as his own and then giving it to others. Okay, someone who just walks around, picks up ideas and famous sayings of other philosophers and then pawns them off as his own. Okay, so they're being sarcastic in calling the Apostle Paul a babbler, being sarcastic about him and his message. But others remarked that it seemed like Paul was advancing foreign gods. And Paul is telling them the good news about Jesus, so why do they say gods in the plural? Well, he was talking about Jesus and the resurrection. And the Greek word for resurrection, anastasis, is very close to the word Anastasia, which was a woman's name in Greek. So some may have thought that Paul was talking about two gods, Jesus and Anastasia. And so they thought, we haven't heard of these gods before, these must be foreign gods. Then reading on in verse 19, it says that then they took Paul to the high council of the city, the Areopagus. Come and tell us about this new teaching, they said. you're saying some rather strange things, and we want to know what it's all about. And then Luke makes this note, it should be explained that all the Athenians, as well as the foreigners in Athens, seem to spend all their time discussing the latest ideas. So they want to hear what Paul has to say. They take him to this place called the Areopagus, also known as Mars Hill. They brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, which is the city council. That's where they met, and that was also what they were called. The city council was called the Areopagus. Civil and criminal trials will be held before this council, but they're also in charge of the religious affairs of the city of Athens. They oversaw all the shrines and temples and all the ceremonies that took place in Athens. Well, I think Paul was probably happy to be taken to the city council to share the message that he was preaching there in Athens. He probably saw this as an opportunity that God had given him to share with the city officials and the audience of all those who were there. So we can learn a lot about Paul's method and tactics in sharing the good news of Jesus with those who know nothing of the gospel and whose culture is very much pagan, very different from our culture as Christians. So Paul starts off very politely, cordially, and we read there in verse 22, Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I notice that you are very religious in every way." Now, if someone said that to you, and you are a person who goes to church a lot, and you hope that you are, really genuine in your faith, that wouldn't offend you, would it? If someone said, "I see that you're very religious in every way," you'd probably take it as a compliment. And so that's probably what Paul was doing. He was starting off with a compliment, something positive he could say about them. He was finding truth, in the situation that he saw there in Athens. They were very religious, not religious in the way that Paul wanted them to be, but they were very religious with all their temples and shrines and altars to all the different gods and goddesses. So Paul was finding a point of contact with them so he could present the truth about God and God's free gift of salvation in Jesus Christ. Okay, and that's a very good way to start off a conversation with a non-believer, because then you have a point of contact and you can lead that conversation then towards something that has to do with the truth of God, something spiritual. Let's start off with something positive. Start talking about something that is near and dear to the heart of the person, some truth that you see in them, in their life. If you're in their office, you see a picture of their family, compliment them on their family. Ask them to tell you more about their family, for example. Or if you see they're reading a book, engage them in a conversation about the book. What is the book? What's it about? Why are you reading it? Why do you find it interesting? Okay? Or if they're talking about a movie or a TV show, and you can ask, "Oh, did you find that interesting? Tell me more about this movie or TV show." You're looking for a point of contact. I heard of a minister who likes to, when he sees someone with tattoos, he likes to go up and start a conversation with them about their tattoos. Okay? Why they chose those tattoos, what those tattoos mean to them. He said it leads to some very interesting insights into the person. Okay? But he likes to talk to people about their tattoos. And that's sort of what Paul is doing. He says something positive, and then he starts talking about, I noticed you have this altar, this shrine to this unknown God. So as we read in verse 23, Paul says, "For as I was walking along, I saw your many shrines. One of your altars had this inscription on it, 'To an unknown God.' This God, whom you worship without knowing, is the one I'm telling you about." So Paul makes his point of contact and leads into telling them about the one true living God. He says, "You're worshiping an unknown God? Let me tell you all about him." Now we wonder, why would the people in Athens have an altar, a shrine to an unknown God? I mean, they had thousands of gods and goddesses that they knew about, that they built altars and shrines to. Why an unknown God? Well, this is a story that's been told that about 600 years before Paul entered into Athens, a terrible plague had fallen on the city, and nothing seemed to stop this plague. So a poet by the name of Epimenides came forward with an idea, a plan. He said, get a flock of black and white sheep and let them loose in the cities. Bring them to the Areopagus and then let them loose from there. Wherever a black or white sheep lay down near a temple or an altar, then sacrifice that sheep to the god or the goddess of that altar. But if a sheep lay down in a place where there was no altar, then it was to be sacrificed to the unknown god. Okay, that's a story. Whether that's the reason why there was a shrine to an unknown god, I don't know, and it doesn't really matter, because the fact is that Athens was filled with these temples, shrines, and altars, and one of them was dedicated to an unknown god. Okay, as I said earlier, our society worships gods of our own making. Our culture is saturated with the worship of sports, sex, pleasure, and many other things, money, politics. Our idols are not statues of gold or marble. Our idols come from things that we love the most. But you know, as Paul was sharing with the people of Athens, life does not have to be filled with such emptiness, such empty things. But we can fill our minds and hearts with the things of God, the things that bring glory to God, and we find all that through Jesus Christ. So Paul was using something that was very common and familiar to the people of Athens as a way to connect them with God, the one true living God. And Paul speaks to the Athenians using their language and concepts that they were familiar with. We too have to speak to people with their language and using the ideas, the concepts, the things that they are familiar with, so that we can then lead the conversation to more serious things, the things of God. In verses 24 to 28, Paul tells them about this God that they were worshiping as an unknown God. And Paul doesn't quote from the Old Testament scriptures in telling about God. He actually quotes twice from two of their own poets, Greek poets. Let's listen to what he says, beginning in verse 24. Paul says about God, He is the God who made the world and everything in it. Since He is the Lord of heaven and earth, He doesn't live in man-made temples, and human hands can't serve His needs. He has no needs. He Himself gives life and breath to everything, and He satisfies every need. From one man He created all the nations throughout the whole earth. He decided beforehand when they should rise and fall, and He determined their boundaries. His purpose was for the nations to seek after God, perhaps feel their way toward Him and find Him, though He is not far from any one of us. For in Him we live and move and exist. As some of your own poets have said, we are His offspring. And since this is true, we shouldn't think of God as an idol designed by craftsmen from gold or silver or stone. That was the truth that Paul was telling them about the one true living God. And the religious Greeks and Romans of Paul's day, they acknowledged all these basic truths about God, just as most religious people today would acknowledge the same truths that Paul presented. Okay? And then Paul establishes these foundational truths and then moves the conversation toward Jesus Christ. We read in verses 30 and 31, Paul goes on to say, God overlooked people's ignorance about these things in earlier times, but now He commands everyone everywhere to repent of their sins and turn to Him. For He has set a day for judging the world with justice by the man He has appointed. That is the Jesus Christ He was telling them about. And he proved to everyone who this is by raising Him from the dead. So Paul gives them some very basic facts about God, the Creator, and God is the Maker. Okay, and He's not the one that is made. He cannot be worshipped by these things that are made. And he said this God, unlike the gods and goddesses of the Greeks and Romans, He doesn't play hide and seek. He's available. He's so close to them that in Him we live and move and have our very existence. And he said, your poets, your own poets, proclaim the same things, that we are His creation, that in him we live and move and have our being. And it says, why would God, the God who is the creator, why would you try and worship him with idols, with statues, with these man-made things? He says it's done in ignorance. And he says the time of ignorance is at an end now. And it's time to repent. It's time for radical change of your life. God is about to come to earth to judge both the living and the dead. And he's already picked out the judge, and he's raised him from the grave. The proof of the preeminence of Christ is the resurrection. So it's no unknown God, but a risen Christ with whom you have to deal. Well, the reaction we read in verses 32 to 34 says, when they heard Paul speak about the resurrection of the dead, some laughed in contempt, but others said, we want to hear more about this later. That ended Paul's discussion with them, but some joined him and became believers. Among them were Dionysius, a member of the council, a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So, as we can see from the story, Paul was a master communicator. He started with a compliment. He was observant, identified points of contact with the people of Athens, and he shared views that he could use to connect those people with the truth about God and then tell people about Jesus. He made an application of the truth that he presented. He presented his audience with a choice. You can either believe what I'm saying or you don't believe it. There's no middle ground. So, as we see, only a few people responded to his message. He was a master communicator, but that day only a few responded and became believers. But Paul planted the seed. And in the days to come, I think some of those who said they wanted to hear more about this from Paul probably did seek Paul out and responded to the truth that he was preaching, the truth of salvation in Jesus Christ. And so during the remaining time that Paul spent in Athens, he taught and encouraged the new believers, and no doubt more believers were added to their number. So we can learn some very practical things from Paul's experience in Athens. We learn how to engage non-believers in conversation, and then politely lead them into talking about spiritual truths and the good news of salvation in Jesus Christ. Just like Paul, we will notice something that causes us to say, I see that you are very religious, or very spiritual, and then we can take that and move on to the truth. But to do that, we have to be observant, keeping our eyes and ears open to what people are experiencing, what they believe, what they are basing their lives on. We look for common points of contact, places where we can connect with people in real ways. And as God gives us the opportunity, we can share with them the truth of who Jesus is and what he has done in our lives.